Hello and welcome to a special episode of These Times. I'm Tom McTague and I'm delighted to welcome the person I think we can now call the favourite to be the next Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch. Or is it Badenoch? I'm never...
It is Badenoch. There is no bad in my name.
Okay, good. Now that is clear. I'm sure I will keep falling into it by mistake, so apologies if I do. I should begin by noting, and I said this off air to Kemi before we started recording, that we're doing this in slightly strange circumstances and rather amusingly from my perspective, given that I'm in Belgium on holiday with my three children and Kemi is in the studio where I usually record, away from her three children. So I'm not sure what that says about modern parenting and all of these comments about being too committed to her children to be able to be leader. But there we are. We'll leave that to other people to decide. So what I'd like to do today is stick to the general tenor of this podcast, which is to focus less on the headlines dominating the news at any particular moment and to focus on the ideas and history that shapes you and is going to shape you as leader and as a prospective prime minister. So let's start with the basics, because not everyone will know this. You were born in Wimbledon, South London, in January 1980, which only makes you a sprightly 44, but you spent most of your first 16 years of life in Lagos, Nigeria, where your father owned a GP practice and your mother was an academic. And you came to Britain in 1996 to live with a friend of your mother's, escaping what seems to be quite a chaotic situation in Nigeria.
That's right.
I think that's a really good place to start. One thing that struck me, Kemi, is that the main thing that is focused or people focus on about you and which you rail against is that you are black, that you are going to be prospectively the first black Conservative Party leader and the first black prime minister. But just thinking about your background, what jumps out to me is that actually a better way perhaps of understanding you was that you would be the first generation migrant leader. And that is perhaps gives you that defines you perhaps a bit better. Is that be a good way of thinking about that?
I think that you said something that's actually very critical, that the use of the word black does not in any way tell you anything about someone. There are so many different groups of people, different experiences who would fall into that category in the same way that, not all white people are the same, that we always need to drill down a little bit more deeply. And my personal experience has shaped me as a politician, because I grew up somewhere that was very different, and I left just as childhood was about coming to an end, becoming an adult. Just that in-between phase was when I came here. So I got to be, a minor in the UK for a couple of years before becoming an adult, and that means that I am very much shaped as much by what I saw growing up in Nigeria, by my experiences in those formative years, sort of 16 to 21. And the profound observation that I have is that people in the UK take so much for granted and assume that because things have been good, they're always going to be good. And of course, the UK is a wealthy country. And of course, the UK is a strong country. And there's so many assumptions that are made without understanding why the UK has come to be how it is. And I think the story of why is actually really special. And it's one which not many countries outside the West have. And even within the West, it is unique as well. And what lessons does this amazing country have for the rest of the world in terms of how to be great, how to get along with everyone else and have a cohesive society too?
Yeah, that word cohesive, I think, is really interesting, because reading your background and listening to some of the other podcasts that you've done with Nick Robinson, you did, I think, a few years ago, as well as one recently on the BBC. You mentioned a book called Why Nations Fail by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson that argues that successful societies are built upon trust, that they are high trust societies. And this is one source of your frustration today, is the way we understand race. As you put it to Nick Robinson, we are being told not to trust one another, that there is something inside of each other that you should distrust.
That's
now,
right.
See, you also, I think, have talked about Roger Scruton as an inspiration. Scruton argued that one of the reasons that there has been a breakdown in trust is that politicians have failed to stand up for the nation, as he saw it, and to affirm what its members see as their inherited rights. Is that something that is close to your understanding of what a government needs to do?
Yes, and it's quite interesting. You have picked two of the four things that I would say fully define my political thinking. If I was going to pick the things, why nations fail is one, and it's topical because they won a Nobel Prize actually last week for that book. I quoted them in my speech in April to the City UK. I made a speech about regulation and where wealth comes from and how Britain didn't make that much money from colonialism. There was actually a lot of poverty and a lot of expense that went along with it. And I was attacked by it. But so I'm glad that that thesis has now won a Nobel Prize. So that book, Why Nations Fail. The second one is Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. I think Thomas Sowell is a genius and not spoken about enough. If he was on the left, he would be feted so much more. The third is Roger Scruton's How to Be a Conservative. So I'm really glad that you mentioned Roger Scruton. And the fourth one is Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, which is an amazing book. It's the last of all of those books that I read and helps to explain why we do have so much division and polarization in society, also in a way that we didn't used to have 30, 40 years ago. That the political divide is getting harder and harder to cross. Trust and trusted institutions, I think, are fundamental to a successful society. Knowing who we can trust now is getting harder and harder, not just because we are becoming more diverse and that creates, that creates some complexity, but also because of social media and the removal of supposed trusted voices who everyone would listen to and say, well, yes, they are the authorities, and if they said it, it must be true. Now everyone has equivalence. Everyone can tweet, and you can get the excellent to the nonsensical having equal weighting. And I think that is making it harder to know what is real, what to believe, and how to pass this information. So I think that the challenge of our era is that we have left the industrial age, 20th century is gone. This is the information age, and there's so much of it. Other countries can influence what's happening with bots and pushing out theories. How do we deal with that so that people know what is real and what isn't real, and politicians can then respond with the right policy, with the right policies?
And Scruton has this insight, which I thought was pertinent to your experience, in that he had this idea that only at the end of things do we begin to understand what we are losing. And it's quite a pessimistic idea, but essentially once you start to see it going, you suddenly realize, God, that's what we had. I thought that insight is quite pertinent to what you're offering, because this is something that not just Scruton has picked up on, but say Kipling has, and his line that, what do they know of England who only England know? And that is something that you're bringing. You're coming to England with a mindset and saying, do you know what you're about to lose? I can see something that you can't. Is that how you understand the benefit of your background over those of us who have only known England and we can't quite see it as closely?
I think it gives some advantages. Obviously, it has other disadvantages as well, but it means that I am very, very crystal clear on what things can look like if they go wrong. So I'm not easily persuaded by a lot of the arguments that the left put about in terms of who is a victim, who is an oppressor. We've been talking about the police a lot over the last few months, two-tier policing, and I trust the police. I think that the police in this country do an amazing job. And when people say that the police treat you differently because of the color of your skin and so on, I'm sure that there will be cases where that has happened. But I grew up in a place where the police looked exactly like me, and they were not nice. They killed people, they were violent, and this is one of the things that I try and explain, that policing is very tough. The concept of policing by consent is so special. The concept of being innocent until you're proven guilty is actually very rare. We are losing this. When people criticize me for saying not all cultures are equally valid, they don't understand what I'm really talking about. They think I'm talking about food or language or accents. What I'm talking about is things like a culture of victim blaming. I grew up in a place where something bad happened to you, it was pretty much your fault and people weren't interested, rather than a culture where if you're accused of something, you're innocent until there's proof otherwise, where if something bad has happened to you, people will investigate what has gone wrong. If you bring people to a country en masse with very different attitudes and you don't have just a muscular emphasis on what is special about this country, what is different, why that's important, it will erode. You can't just take it for granted. You can't just assume that everybody understands these things which were imbibed, because they don't. And whenever people say what's needed, I say we need more muscular liberalism. And I say this as a conservative. But I think that liberals, the old classic liberals, are today's conservatives, because what we're trying to conserve now is actually the old classic liberalism. And it has suffered because it has allowed something masquerading as civil rights to undermine it. I say liberalism has been hacked. It's being exploited by people who've worked out where the cracks are. And you need muscular liberalism to push back on that. And that means emphasizing principles. It means emphasizing values, which sound old-fashioned to people who just want to talk about policy and let's talk about AI and let's talk about NHS reform. I want to talk about freedom of speech. Not just that, freedom of association, something that many people don't understand. Freedom of association is very precious. Yes, it means that sometimes bad people we don't like will come together, but it is so critical. Free enterprise. So many of those concepts are just becoming, buzzwords rather than things that underpin all of our public policy making. And they should be at the heart of public policy making.
Well, that's fascinating. We're going to come back to that question of economics and how you apply your instincts here to economics. Just quickly, though, I think there is this great irony of your candidature, which is the principle, or one of the existential challenges to the Conservative Party is clearly from reform. And so you have on your opponent has an argument, which is you could argue is a kind of maximalist position, and you stake that out, and it's to draw a line, almost like Boris Johnson did in 2019, and say we are going to leave the ECHR. We're going to make every member of the Conservative Party sign up to it. If they don't sign up to it, they're out. And this is a way to both create a dividing line with the Labour Party, but also to try and crush reform. You have not gone that far, but what you offer is something different, which is to defeat an existential threat to the Conservative Party on this largely on this principal challenge of migration. The Conservative Party looks set to elect a first-generation migrant. That is not something that you would necessarily have thought would be possible.
No, and it's only in a few countries that it would be possible. And I think it is actually an example of how this is still a high-trust society. And it's something which I think it is very important that I myself ensure that this does not become a talking point outside just how good it is that the UK has a meritocracy. That is the principle that is being portrayed here. That people in this country don't care what you look like. They don't care where you're from. They care what you are about, what you are going to do. And that very much is what my campaign is about. It is about the future. What kind of country do we want? We are already a multiracial country. There's no going back on that. People who may not like that, there's nothing we can do for them. But what does multiculturalism mean? There are some cultures that integrate well, others don't. I think that I'm somebody who can have a better conversation, a more sophisticated conversation that actually gets right down to the core of what it is that we need to do in order to keep going without running into bear traps, without stoking, those sorts of sentiments that, the ethnic nationalism and so on, which are very problematic and which always end up in conflict, even when everybody looks the same. You look at civil wars around the world, people look the same, but you start stoking those things, you end up in a very bad place. And I think that I'm somebody who can deal with that and bridge bridge that divide.
Can I return one last time to Scruton, because he has another idea about this, which is he wrote that the central idea behind English or British nationalism wasn't nationalism or empire, but an idea of home. England was first and foremost a place, he wrote, consecrated by custom. And the disquiet over immigration, as he put it, was the result not of racism, but of the disruption of an old experience of home and a loss of the enchantment which made a place feel like home, of safety and consolation. Do you think he's onto something there?
Very much so. And I can say that because I also know how people react in other countries when things don't look familiar. Nostalgia is actually a very, very powerful emotion. Having an anchor on what used to be helps people stay rooted in a community. So when I gave my campaign launch, I talked about the principles which underpin my conservatism. Personal responsibility, we've talked about freedom, but citizenship is something which I think is absolutely critical. And I emphasize very strongly that citizenship is not about having a passport. There are loads of people, I've got a British passport, I'm a British citizen, I've got all these different passports, dual, sometimes triple citizenship. That is not what citizenship means to me. Citizenship to me means being rooted in a place, wanting it to succeed. It's not about what you look like, but about who your neighbors are. You don't just want yourself to succeed. You want your neighborhood to do well. You want your neighbors to do well. You want the success of your country for the next generation. And you're not obsessed about what's happening thousands of miles away, either out of prurient interest or because of some ancestral history that you might have. And we don't demand that of people. And when I say this, the liberal commentariats and the interviewers will say, well, how do you do that? How do you do that? It's not about filling in forms and tick boxes and taking a citizenship test. These are things that all of society have to, sort of help enforce very subtly by talking about values, by saying, no, we don't think this is acceptable, by having debates, not by shutting down debate and telling people what they can and cannot say. And government has a place in that. Government cannot control everything, but government does have some ability to help shape culture. It cannot control it, but it can say, this is what we think. It can support those people who are doing the right thing. And I think what Scruton talks about also informs what I think that we should ask of people who are coming to our country, that this is our home. We've got nowhere else. It is not a dormitory. It is not a hotel for people who are just passing by, want to make some money. And yes, there is a place for that. But we should want people who want the success of the UK. I am horrified when I see those vox pops and those TikTok things where young people say, well, I wouldn't fight for the army. I'm not really from here. They think it's cool to say, oh, I'm not from here. All this nonsense we get every St. George's Day. Oh, well, St. George wasn't English. He was Turkish and so on. And there's no such thing as English culture. This is nonsense. Trying to pretend that culture is always something that comes from elsewhere and what we have here is not real. I think that these are actually very destructive ideas that undermine a lot of the fabric of society that binds people together. And I'm not afraid to say that.
I wonder if we can project this forward, what kind of policy solutions would come from that insight? You've talked about, obviously, that you don't think that governments control culture or governments have a role in just demanding things from people or creating bureaucratic exercises to, create a sense of home. But you've talked about, and perhaps this is the slight difference between you and Jenrick. Jenrick has talked about the ECHR. That's the central dividing line for him. And you have talked about perhaps having an immigration system that reflects cultural affinity to the UK. So those who come to assimilate, and therefore it is less of an issue automatically. Now, how does that work in practice? Let's even just take, say, Nigeria as an example. Would you have certain Nigerians like yourself, English-speaking Christian Nigerians? Would they be able to assimilate more easily than, say, non-English-speaking Muslim Nigerians? How would that work?
So one of the things that we need to work out is what makes migration successful. What are the different elements that help some people do well and others not do well? There are some people who do come to this country. They have, a minority religious background. They don't speak English, but they want to be a part of here. And you see it in the children that they have, the next generation, how they've brought them up to integrate and assimilate. So I think it is more complex than that. But it requires understanding exactly how our immigration system works. And I do find that a lot of British people don't know how the immigration system works in this country. I know a bit more because I have family outside the country. I know, sort of what the barriers and the borders are when people are applying for tourist visas and so on. But for example, the rules around getting automatic citizenship after a specific period of time based on the bureaucratic test clearly have not been good enough in terms of deciding who gets to stay. So it's not about just who gets to come in, but what rights you accumulate while you're here, who gets to stay. Who gets to vote is fascinating. Commonwealth immigrants can vote, EU citizens cannot vote. These are historical things which probably should be looked at again. I think there's a big difference now between what the Commonwealth was 50 years ago from what it is now. But many people don't understand those different, how these rules have come to be. And it was what I said to you before we started the podcast, that the legacy of empire is something that many people miss. So if you read certain nasty comments on Twitter, you'll hear lots of people describing me as an anchor baby, that my mother came here to have me so that I could get citizenship. They don't know that you didn't need all of that. In the 60s and 70s, I was born right at the beginning of 1980. You didn't need that. You just could come into the country whenever you liked. You didn't need a citizenship to live here or work here. If you were in the Commonwealth, you just came here, and that was that. And that's how the Windrush scandal happened, because lots of people didn't have any papers, and then institutional memory fades, and there's an assumption that, well, you must have had papers, or otherwise you're here illegally, and then you have a problem. We need people to understand the history of immigration, but also the history of the system. And one of the things I keep telling people is that the system is broken. We keep layering lots and lots of new regulations without looking at how laws came to be, why they are the way they are, thinking very deeply about policy making, not just from focus groups or, light technical exercises, but thinking very deeply and fundamentally. And this is the key difference between me and Rob. We don't actually disagree substantially on fundamental issues. It is the approach that is different, that I like to take my time. I like to get right down to the root of things, as he wants answers quickly. Well, this is what people say, so let's give them that. I just don't think that works in the long term. I think about the long term.
Well, it's interesting because you're talking there about some of the rules around immigration that first came to being in 1968 and 1971. I think they were two big.
And even before then, yes, you're right.
Yeah, so there were a few big sort of moments in time. And of course, one of Roger Scruton's great conservative icons at the time was Enoch Powell. And Powell had this notion that actually Britain was obsessed by the Commonwealth because it just used it as a figment of our imagination to pretend that the empire hadn't gone, and that we were sort of creating this strange idea that didn't really conform to the reality of what actually existed. And he wanted us to focus on the nation that he saw sort of standing amid the ruins of empire. But both yourself and Rob have looked back to that period of time, that those migration rules, and how Rob talks about how they've changed in around 97, 98, where you had this big increase in migration, principally from Europe. But you seem to be talking about the need for a sort of new reset, another kind of root and branch look at this, that actually the Commonwealth is not what it was. There is a kind of something in that power-light analysis.
Well, I think that we do need to look at the world as it is now. And it was the point I was making about how we are now in the information age. There is a whole new set of issues that our generation has to deal with that previous generations didn't. Global mass migration is one of them. This is not just affecting the UK. It's affecting all of Western Europe. It's affecting the US, Australia, everywhere. That's one thing. The rapid technological innovations, social media and so on, mobile phones, the prevalence of mobile phones, how that helps global mass migration, the way people can access information about a country, all of those things have an impact. An aging society. We are living longer. We have not re-engineered ourselves to deal with that. How do we create growth when you have countries like China that are hacking, industrialization and so on? These are very new problems, and they all need to, they've been coming up for a while, but they need to be looked at in tandem, not just little bits of policy here and there, and, we might tax this, we'll have a little tariff there. There's an axis of authoritarian states that is collaborating against the West. Iran, Russia, China. It's not like it used to be in the 80s. So there is a big reset that needs to happen. And you look at the conversation that Keir Starmer's been having in Samoa about reparations. This is serious stuff. When I was talking about these things years ago and saying we should not be having these conversations, people poo-pooed me and said, why are you talking about this? Just talk about the economy. These things are linked. The economic side and the social or cultural side, whatever you want to call it, go hand in hand. And these other countries look at us as a country that owes them. And if you start down that road, it is not going to end well. If you have strong convictions, you start with principles, you will not run into trouble when you're at a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting and people start talking about reparations. Because Labour has been playing with these ideas, their student politics informs it, they love this stuff here. Now they're in the big leagues and they realize it's actually causing problems. They don't know how to respond because they have fundamentally different principles from conservatives like us. And this is why I want to show real, genuine, authentic conservatism. People think that the Labour Party and the Conservatives are the same thing. We are not. There are fundamental differences. And if we start talking about those principles and those values, rather than just policy and policy without plans, if we start talking about what distinguishes us from the left, I believe we will start to do better and reform will not have the oxygen that it has been given.
That's interesting there, because you're sort of placing Britain then, not just that we need to rebuild the sense of home in Britain, but also this sense of that Britain belongs into a Western civilization, if that's a fair understanding of what you've said, and that needs to be defended as well. And there are countries beyond that include China, Iran, Russia perhaps, that are not part of that. And that we need to protect ourselves economically based on that understanding of culture. Is that
That's quite right.
belief?
That's quite right.
Because that again is Scrutonian. Scruton's got this quote: "A country's stability is enhanced by economic growth, but it depends far more upon this sense that we belong together." That is your view.
Yes. And economic growth without having strong cultural ties binding the country is superficial. And this is how we ran into problems where we were just measuring GDP from immigration without looking at what kind of GDP we were creating, and not even looking at GDP per capita, which is not a silver bullet itself. You can have good GDP per capita and still have very serious disparities in income. If you have very, very wealthy people and very poor people, GDP per capita is not a good benchmark for how well you're doing. So looking at things that are real, not just the paper metrics, they're not enough. You have to pay attention to what's happening around you. And what I find is that a lot of policymakers, not just politicians, but a lot of the people, in Whitehall, in these quangos and so on, they mean well. They're not bad people, but they are insulated from a lot of the decisions that they make. And this is how luxury beliefs creep into the system. People who live in nice areas don't mind if you have prisoners coming out a little bit early, because they're not the ones who are going to have to deal with them. My experience moving into this country was not my family background experience. I always tell people that I came from a middle class. It was actually, an upper middle class background in Nigeria. And the experience that I had here was nothing like that. It was a working class life that I was living. So I understand, I'm not working class, but the life I was living certainly was. That shaped a lot of how I see things, that people make all sorts of decisions that are fine for middle class people who are going to go to Oxbridge and there's no problem. And then the other people who don't have all of those levers, who don't have the ladder to climb, have to deal with the nonsense that's left from those who have luxury beliefs and never have to experience the consequences of the policies that they're putting out. I'm very, very much against that.
So I don't know if this is fair, but look, there was a famous moment where Nigel Farage is asked about Brexit, and he essentially says, look, even if it makes us poorer, it's worth it because it's about something more. That's kind of what you're saying now. I mean, what is the big difference then between yourself and that kind of Farageist understanding of politics? Like, what is going to differentiate the Conservative Party and reform under your leadership?
So I don't agree that even if it makes us poorer, it's worth it. It is about the exact trade-off that you are making. It's not just about something being a universal good. And when I voted Leave, it was very, very fine. I tell people that my husband and I had exactly the same views, and he voted Remain and I voted Leave. And the difference was purely risk appetite, that I felt that the EU was going down a certain path. And if it wanted to go down that path, we should just let them and get off there, have close relationships, but let them go off on the journey that they want. No more integration, that where we were was absolutely fine. I also didn't like what they had done with citizenship. In 2015, what Angela Merkel did was a fundamental violation of my view of citizenship. It's not just passport citizenship, which is what she created, and created lots of EU citizens without anybody else's consent. I thought that was wrong. Now, that was a finely balanced trade-off because I knew that there were many benefits that we had from the EU. But once it is time to leave, then you've got to be full-throated in it and make sure that you deliver benefits, second, third order benefits. And this is where my issues started. When a lot of people in my party too thought, well, we've left, that's fine, let's go off and do something else. And I kept saying, no, this project has just started. We have to make sure it delivers for people. This is why I was so hell-bent on deregulating. This is why I wanted us to sign those trade deals that would set us up for the future, not just today, not just tomorrow, but for years and decades to come. But it's also why when we had things like the repeal of EU law, I looked at the fundamentals. We want to get the European Court of Justice out of our system, out of our legal framework, yes, but not all these laws are bad. So let's keep the ones that we want to keep. Some of them will need to be reformed. So we have to keep them first to reform them. And then let's get rid of these other ones. And the fact that I didn't just say I'm setting fire to all of this angered a lot of people. And this is the difference between me and Farage. That for him, it is very superficial. It's just, well, we're going to do this. It's the symbolism rather than the deeply thought through plan. I don't do symbolism. I think that a lot of politics is very gimmicky. I think that reform is very gimmicky. They are very much about pulling things down rather than building things up. I know that they have some diagnoses of what's wrong, but they're not about strengthening institutions. I am. And that's a fundamental difference. That's the Conservative Party that I'm standing for.
Can I ask then one specific question on that, just to see how you would respond as Prime Minister? Now, there's one issue coming up right now that I think is a fascinating insight into the way the future of the world economy is going. And it raises a lot of these questions that you and I have been talking about during this episode, and is the question of what to do about China. Now, the United States, under Trump or Biden, is pursuing a similar policy towards China, and you could actually say to some extent on the border when it comes to migration. The same with the EU. For all the rhetoric that the EU is markedly different from a Trump America, they're pursuing a very similar policy on migration, and I think have just voted for a very similar policy on tariffs that the United States is pursuing. That is to increase tariffs to something like 100% on particularly the import of electric cars. Britain, under Rachel Reeves, even though she has made this big thing of securonomics, has not decided to follow through on this. We are not having any tariffs on the import of Chinese cars. And that seems to be a Treasury-led idea that we don't have a domestic industry that is worth protecting. And so we benefit from having the import of cheap cars. How do you deal with that problem as a Conservative Prime Minister?
First of all, can I just say there's no such thing as securonomics. This is a nonsense. This is a nonsense idea which I criticised back when we were in government and she was giving those speeches. But there is a fundamental incoherence in policy that started even when we were in government, and which Labour are doubling, in fact, tripling down on, and that's going to create problems. And that incoherence comes from not wanting to recognise trade-offs. It's what I said the last time I stood for leader, that there are no real solutions. There are only trade-offs. There are no perfect solutions. There are only trade-offs. And if you think you can have it all, you're going to run into trouble. How have we come to this policy incoherence? It is by having a net zero policy that's just a target without looking at the systemic impacts it's going to have across the board. And this is one of the things that I've tried to say over and over again. I'm not a climate change skeptic, but I am a skeptic of net zero policy as it was made. I said so at the time, but also as it is being implemented. A lot of it on the fly. That's why we're going 2030, 2035, 2030 on electric vehicles. Now, as business secretary, I heard that the EU was going to put tariffs on Chinese cars. And I asked for the data on whether we thought that there was a flooding of our market by Chinese vehicles. And the data said, no, there wasn't. So I didn't make that decision either. But that's because I don't like rushing into things, and I don't like let's just slap a tariff here or there. But one of the things that people don't see is that you can have retaliatory tariffs created. And we also have other industries that could suffer if we did something like that in a way that the EU doesn't. So we need to understand that much of the difficulty we're having is because we have, as cross-party said, we want net zero. And people say, well, are you for net zero or are you not for net zero? That is the wrong question. If you want to do net zero, how do you want to do it? What is the price you're prepared to pay? What is the trade-off that you want to make? That is how you make policy. This is what is different between Rob Jenrick and myself, that it isn't just about the headline. It is about the systemic plan that it underpins all of these decisions. For what it's worth, I think that we are moving too fast on the transition to electric vehicles. I worry about many of the components. I look at what we're having to do with gigafactories. We are enriching China because they are able to do this at scale in a way that we are not. And they're happy to open a coal-fired power station every week. I don't think our net zero policy is coherent. When we're shutting down oil and gas, you see what Labour has done, doubling down on some minor decisions that we made. They've closed the coal-fired station that we had wanted to open up north. This is not coherent, and we are going to run into problems. They are governing by announcement, they are governing by slogan, and they're governing with hopes and wishes and dreams. That's not what I do. And that is why I think that we need to go back to first principles on what we are trying to achieve. And if we do get to net zero and other countries don't do it, what are the second and third order benefits that we are getting? If we bankrupt ourselves trying to get to net zero, no other country is going to follow us. So we need to have a strategy that meets those objectives and decides what the trade-offs will be. Now, it might be that people decide that, well, we're quite happy for China to make lots of money, and we're quite happy to have electric vehicles, even though they're very expensive and their second-hand value is not that much. It's worth it. But let's be honest. Let's tell the truth. I want us to tell the truth, not just do government by announcement.
Well, one person who says that there isn't a trade-off on one particularly acute part of the net zero drive is Ed Miliband, who says that there isn't a trade-off between reindustrializing the country and getting to net zero at speed. So a lot of people would say, no, you have to choose between the two, that if you want to get to net zero very, very quickly, you just have to buy off the shelf from Denmark or from Spain or from China, whoever is producing the cheapest solar panels, the cheapest wind turbines, whatever it may be, the cheapest electric cars, say. And then there are others who say, no, you should prioritize the reindustrialization of the British economy to produce these things ourselves, but they'll be more expensive and they'll take longer. Where do you sit on that scale?
I like to use this phrase from Thomas Sowell, which is about thinking beyond page one, or getting to page 2 and 3. Those are all page 1 answers. What we need to do is look at what we mean exactly by deindustrialization. So what's the problem we're trying to solve here? National resilience is absolutely key. Energy security is key. So on steel, when I was business secretary, we had a conundrum with steel, where we decided that we were going to get to net zero. The biggest carbon emitters are steel plants. Port Talbot was one of them. And as it happens, because of what China is doing with steel, flooding the market, the companies that were running these companies were losing about £1 million to £1.5 million a day. That's not sustainable. You need governments to work with them. So my objective was we've got to make sure we have domestic steel production. That is a non-starter to close them down. But we also have this legislation that nobody's prepared to repeal on net zero. How do we match those two things together? And that the answer to that is electric arc furnaces. But if you're going to have electric arc furnaces, you're going to need cheaper energy. And that means looking at energy policy. So all of this stuff is systemic. Nothing can sit in isolation. I want a much cheaper, an energy policy that delivers much cheaper energy for people. That means looking at what we're doing with oil and gas. That means looking at the levies that we're putting in and the taxes on energy. So you start from one place, and then you have to keep going further and further down and make sure that it is all linked. Instead, what we've had recently is The energy department is doing one thing on net zero. Business department is saying something else. Someone else wants to do something on trade and tariffs, and it's all over the place. This is incoherent policy. And this is why I am not throwing policy ideas out there. I want us to pull it all together. And I know this is a difficult message for a lot of people to hear. And it may be that I lose this leadership contest because I've tried to do this the hard way. But I think if we do it the hard way, we will have a much likely a chance of succeeding than doing it the easy way now, throwing out policies and then not being able to get a consensus later on. And that's something, that's really important to me. I would rather lose because I didn't offer easy solutions than win taking the shortcuts. I don't want to win with the shortcuts.
Interesting. Well, I know I haven't got you for that much longer, so I wanted to run through a few final topics, if I may. The first is America. I'd be interested to know your analysis of the election at the moment. Do you have a candidate that you want to win, and what do you think that Britain could learn from Donald Trump in particular?
I think that it is not appropriate for somebody who is going for the position that I'm going to talk about their personal preferences in a leader. I wouldn't like it if an American was saying, oh, well, I'd like Rob Jenrick or I'd like Kemi Badenoch. I think that at the level we're at, it's not appropriate. When I was trade secretary, I actually had people from other countries say, when you guys do this, it's very unhelpful because it undermines us even as we're trying to work with you. I want whoever's going to be great for the UK. I want whoever's going to be best for the world. And I will do everything I can to work with who leads the US. They are an allied country. And if they are successful in what they do for the US, we in the UK will be successful. It'll be great for the world.
Okay, outside of those two leaders then, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, outside of Margaret Thatcher and the four people that you've mentioned as your inspirations, is there a leader that you look to in particular that you think offered the kind of leadership that Britain needs today?
Well, whenever people ask who in politics I admire, I often talk about Eri Neave. Now, he wasn't an obvious leader. He wasn't a president or a prime minister. But I think sometimes the very best people don't end up in those positions. And it wasn't just what he did during World War II or escaping from Colditz. It was what he did for Mrs. Thatcher at the time, supporting her. And it shows that no one ever does these things on their own. We invest so much in specific individuals without looking at the team that is behind them. Building a strong team, supporting other people is actually part of leadership. I think the way he died as well was also it was horrific, but also the sacrifice that a lot of people make to get a safe and secure country. Those people who take very tough decisions often end up losing a lot. And I think that he sets a great example. He sets a great example about duty, sacrifice, responsibility, loving your country. So I really love Eri Neave.
Who's your Eri Neave then?
Who's my Eri Neave? Probably quite a few people. Lee Rowley is probably my Eri Neave. He's running my campaign. And he is somebody who I came into politics with. He's very different from me. He's a working class guy from Northeast Derbyshire. But we have very similar outlooks on life. And he's done so much to help me. I could not be doing this without him. That is a person who, I call every day. I talk to, how do we do this? It's a joint project, not just between the two of us, but quite a few people. And I've loved having people like David Davis and Ian Duncan Smith, put their names and their reputations on the line and say it should be her. I don't think they know how much it has meant to me. It's been really special. Okay,
so Lee's the one to watch then. I'll keep an eye on it. The whole press pack will be going towards him now. So final couple of things. Israel and Iran, obviously that. Over the weekend, we've had Israel attacking directly into Iran. You've been very prominent in your support for Israel. Do you think, though, it's reaching a moment where Israel needs to start to be restrained because of the risks of this tipping into a much bigger global conflict?
So, we always say that Israel has a right to defend itself. I don't like wading into what a country that has been under attack should or shouldn't do. They have their intelligence. We have intelligence that we provide to them, as does the US. I think that they are a country that is under attack from all sides in a way that we will never understand. And I don't know enough about the specifics they are seeing in the background. I don't necessarily trust all of the reporting that we see on media and social media. So what I don't want to do is just pass random running commentary on the situation that they're in. I don't think it's helpful.
Okay. And what about Ukraine? Do you have some kind of sense that we're reaching a moment here where we need to break out of the parameters that we've been thinking about Ukraine for the last few years, which is, we've got to defend Ukraine. We've got to ensure that Ukraine can win. Have we reached a point where that is no longer possible?
No, I don't think we've got to that point. No.
Okay, and what about the presence now of like North Korean soldiers fighting on European soil? This, to me, seems just an extraordinary moment that is reminiscent of previous crises like the Korean War, where you're suddenly seeing a specific war become a global war, almost without.
Well, the comment I made about there being an axis of authoritarian states that are collaborating against the West, that is a classic example of what I'm talking about. And, we can all feel it's extraordinary and, and ask ourselves what's going on. But, what I would like to finish on is saying that we need to get serious. We have spent the peace dividend from the 80s and onwards. Dangerous times appear to be coming again. Are we ready? I would like to see us spending more on defense. We can't afford to do that. When I was in cabinet, we talked about how we could get to 3% by 2030. We couldn't make the numbers work. This is why I say, the economic and the social, the cultural, they're all interlinked. We need to rewire our economy to be able to spend more on defense. We need to stop messing around with trivial things like smoking in pub gardens, football regulators, and the sentience of crustaceans. I think we debated that in Parliament. This is not serious. We need serious politicians for serious times, not just people who make announcements and hope someone else will work it out. And that is what I'm offering. We need to win back the trust of the British people. And I think that with the first question to answer is what kind of leader do they want? And I think that I am bringing something different than what we've had before. And I hope that the Conservative Party members put their trust in me to become the next leader of our party and the opposition.
Well, with that, we'll bring this interview to a close. Kemi Badenoch, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, Tom.